I know we all like to clown boomers, Gen Xers, and even millennials, and I love to clown on Generation Z and even Gen Alpha. But when I tell you that the older generation is not as wise as you may think they are, now what counts as the older generation? I'm talking about from boomers to Gen Xers and now millennials, because they're raising kids now. You got some Generation Zs raising kids, but we're talking about the older generation. Now, as a child, I used to think that older folks were so wise and that they knew everything. But now that I'm older and I've been around for a minute, you start to notice that most older folks don't really know too much of anything outside of their own lived experience, and that their timeline is different from our timeline. Now, does every older person go through the same experience? No, they don't. I'm talking about the casual boomer with their old traditional hierarchy of masculine roles or femininity, and how they try to pass it on to the younger generation. Like I could tell you this story. I was in a store once. There was this one older woman that was just telling her child some shit and basically telling her child to disrespect other people. Now, this was an older lady. She looked like she could be in her 50s or something, maybe her 40s. And I just looked at her and I knew that she learned that from her parents. Parents always pass down what they hate to their children so their children can pass down what they hate to their children. And I see this so many times. And we got to start with boomers. Now, most of our experiences here around my age, Generation Z, we grew up in the technology era. There's so many more opportunities out there. Yet at the same time, most of us struggle to get a job. The housing prices have increased. Gas prices are going up. And when we talk about boomers, housing prices weren't that high back then. Back then, the hierarchy of society, getting married easily, having children just to pass it down. Like my family, or my mom and my dad, they have a lot of siblings. Because back then, I wouldn't say it was easier, but it was definitely more of a traditional way to, form a cliche family, passing the torch. But nowadays, it's not like that anymore. Like those old traditional roles don't work for Generation Z and Generation Alpha. And I'm part of Generation Z. Like that old traditional shit that they tell us, even when it applies to getting a job, walk in there with a firm handshake and a resume, that doesn't always work. Nowadays, you get artificial intelligence where they take one look at you, or they take one look at your work experience, and you'll just say no. Now, boomers, a lot of people like to make fun of them and tell them that they don't know what they're talking about. They clown them on Facebook and other sites, other social media platforms. But when it comes to boomers, keep in mind that these folks, I'm trying to summarize this as best as I can, they really don't know too much about the modern world. And I'm not trying to say Generation Z is this wise generation because that's further from the truth. There's a reason why Gen Z and Gen Alpha are so mucked up. But we'll talk about that in a minute. Let's go ahead and talk about the Gen Xers, or the smoking generation, as I like to call them. Gen X is where you'll start to see a change from the traditional boomers lifestyle. I like to call this the rebellion generation. The old traditional ways that boomers were trying to teach their kids, Gen Xers threw that away, which then formed into the millennials. Now, everybody has a problem with millennials, even millennials. But when we talk about millennials, they're really responsible for the modern technology that we have today. But with that being said, when I tell you that millennials are some of the hardest people to work with, most of them are stuck up. You see, they have this entitlement issue. They think that they're better, that they know it all. That's most of them because of the way they were raised. Because most of these millennials were raised by Gen Xers, the rebellion generation. So millennials nowadays, most of them are responsible for writing the TV shows and most of today's media. Why many people complain, why some modern movie jokes don't hit the same, or some character writing is cliche. I'll talk about that in another video. But in real life, millennials, they have this habit of clinging on to their childhood. Since I kind of grew up in that more, 90s generation. A perfect example of this is the Stranger Things TV show. Takes place in the 80s, goes through the 90s. You start to see their traditions and how much millennials kind of shape today's pop culture. Now we go on to Generation Z. Generation Z feels like the leftovers of the millennials. Now, everybody in this generation is not as bad as you may think they are. But Generation Z are kind of like Millennial 2.0. And that being, most of them are hard to work with, most of them are stuck up, and I think life is this cake woke, and I think everything comes to them more easily. And then we have Generation Alpha, the generation they're trying to raise today. And you know the problems with Generation Alpha. And their teachers who keep complaining, saying that Gen Alpha doesn't want to learn, these teachers are Generation Z teachers and Millennial teachers. And they're the ones to blame because they're part of the generation that didn't want to learn either, just like the previous generation, Generation X. And boomers, what's funny to think about it? Because boomers are kind of like the go-to dartboard to blame whenever it comes to the mistakes of the modern generations. But I would like to say it's more of a chain reaction. Boomers messed up because of Generation X, who rebelled against their traditions. Generation X messed up because millennials followed their rebellious nature. And Generation Z was raised by millennial culture and traditions, which led us to the technology age, with social media and all that. And Generation Alpha is kind of like the newborn baby I was brought into this world of artificial intelligence and other vapid content that won't really lead them anywhere. But that's just my take on it. With that being said, what's your favorite generation? What's your least favorite generation? And which generation do you think is objectively the worst? But with that being said, this is me signing out.